Imagine this. It's 7 o'clock on a winter evening in 1850. The sun vanished hours ago, and darkness has swallowed the world outside your window. There's no switch to flip, no bulb to illuminate your room, no television to entertain you, no refrigerator humming in the kitchen. The only light comes from a flickering candle or oil lamp, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Your day isn't ending. It's transforming into something entirely different. This wasn't the exception. This was life for virtually every human being who ever lived until just 150 years ago. For the overwhelming majority of human history, electricity was nothing more than a mysterious force observed in lightning strikes. People lived their entire lives without ever experiencing the flip of a switch, the glow of an electric bulb, or the convenience of electric power. Yet somehow they filled their days with purpose, productivity, and meaning. They built civilizations, created art, raised families, and found joy in ways that might seem almost incomprehensible to us today. What did these billions of people actually do with their time? How did they structure their days without the rhythms of electric lighting? How did they work, play, learn, and love in a world governed entirely by the sun and seasons? The answers reveal not just how different life was, but how profoundly electricity has reshaped not just our activities, but our very conception of time itself. To understand pre-electric life, we must first grasp just how recently electricity entered human existence. The first practical incandescent light bulb wasn't perfected until 1879. Electric power grids didn't begin spreading through cities until the 1880s and 1890s. Rural electrification didn't reach most farming communities until the 1930s or even later. This means that your great-great-grandparents, and possibly even your great-grandparents, lived most or all of their lives in a world without electric power. Consider the mathematics of human existence. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. If we compress that entire timeline into a single year, electricity has only been widely available for the last 4 hours of December 31st. For 364 days, 20 hours of that year, humans lived without electric power. Every single thing they accomplished, the pyramids of Egypt, the philosophy of ancient Greece, the art of the Renaissance, the exploration of the world's oceans, the founding of nations, all of it happened during those electricityless eons. CT, rhythm of pre-electric life, was fundamentally different from ours. While we live by clock time, dividing our days into precise hours and minutes, pre-electric people lived by what historians call natural time or task time. Their days were structured around the sun's movement, the seasons' changes, and the completion of essential tasks rather than the arbitrary divisions of mechanical timekeeping. Dawn marked the beginning of the active day for most people throughout history. As the first light crept across the horizon, families would begin stirring in their homes. But this wasn't the rushed awakening we know today, with alarm clocks jarring us from sleep. Instead, people often woke gradually as light filtered through windows or as roosters announced the coming day. The concept of the snooze button would have been utterly foreign. When daylight arrived, it was time to begin the day's work. The morning hours were precious because they offered the best natural light for detailed work. Women would often begin their days by rekindling fires that had been carefully banked overnight. In many homes, maintaining a continuous fire was crucial, not just for warmth and cooking, but because starting a fire from scratch was a time-consuming and sometimes difficult process. Before matches became common in the mid-1800s, people relied on flint and steel, fire pistons, or maintaining embers from the previous day's fire. Once fires were burning, the morning hours were typically devoted to the most important tasks of the day. Farmers would tend to their animals, feed livestock, and begin field work. Craftsmen would tackle their most detailed projects while their eyes were fresh and the light was good. Women would often do their finest needlework, spinning or food. Preparation during these prime morning hours. Children in pre-electric societies didn't have the luxury of sleeping in or lounging in bed. From a young age, they were expected to contribute to household tasks. A typical day for a child might begin with collecting eggs from chickens, feeding animals, or helping to prepare the morning meal. Education, when it was available, often took place during the middle hours of the day, when natural light was strongest. The midday period represented the peak of activity in most pre-electric societies. This was when the sun provided maximum illumination, making it the ideal time for work requiring good vision. Farmers would be in their fields, artisans would be at their benches, and merchants would be conducting business in markets and shops. The concept of a lunch hour, as we know it, didn't exist. People ate when they were hungry and when their work permitted, often without stopping their activities entirely. Interestingly, many pre-electric societies developed sophisticated ways to maximize the use of natural light. Windows were positioned strategically to capture morning and afternoon sun. Workshops were oriented to take advantage of north light, which provided consistent illumination throughout the day without the harsh shadows created by direct sunlight. Reflective surfaces like polished metal mirrors or white painted walls were used to bounce light into darker corners of rooms. As afternoon moved toward evening, the nature of activities began to shift. Work requiring fine motor skills or detailed vision would gradually give way to tasks that could be performed with less precise sight. This might include basic food preparation, simple crafts, or maintenance work. The approaching darkness created a natural deadline that governed the day's rhythm in a way that artificial lighting has completely eliminated from modern life. The evening hours in pre-electric society were perhaps the most dramatically different from our contemporary experience. As daylight faded, families would gather around their primary source of artificial light, whether a fireplace, oil lamps, or candles. These gathering points became the social center of the home, where the day's events were discussed, stories were told, and family bonds were strengthened. Artificial lighting in the pre-electric era was expensive, dim, and often dangerous. Candles were costly to make or purchase, and they provided only a fraction of the light we take for granted today. A single candle produces roughly 1% of the light output of a modern 100-watt bulb. Oil lamps were somewhat brighter, but required constant maintenance and careful handling to prevent fires. This meant that evening activities were carefully chosen based on the available light. Reading was a precious activity reserved for those who could afford both books and adequate lighting. Families fortunate enough to own books might gather around the best lamp to read aloud together, sharing stories, religious texts, or news from the outside world. This communal reading created shared cultural experiences and helped spread literacy even among those who couldn't read themselves. Storytelling became a crucial form of entertainment and education during the long evening hours. Oral traditions flourished in pre-electric societies, partly because spoken stories required no artificial light and could entertain multiple people simultaneously. Grandparents would pass down family histories, local legends, and moral lessons through storytelling. Professional storytellers were valued members of many communities, traveling from place to share news and entertainment. Handicrafts that could be performed by touch or in dim light became common evening activities. Knitting, for instance, was particularly well suited to evening work because experienced knitters could work by feel. Men might repair tools or harnesses, work that required more strength than fine vision. Women would often do mending or simple sewing, tasks that kept their hands busy while allowing for conversation. Music played a much larger role in pre-electric entertainment than it does today. Without recorded music or electric amplification, live performance was the only way to enjoy musical entertainment. Families would gather around pianos, guitars, or other instruments for evening entertainment. Community singing was common, with people learning songs through repetition and participation rather than through sheet music or recordings. The concept of prime time entertainment didn't exist because there was no technology to broadcast shows to multiple homes simultaneously. Instead, entertainment was personal, immediate, and participatory. People made their own fun, rather than consuming entertainment created by others. This led to communities where nearly everyone had some musical, storytelling, or craft skills, because these abilities were necessary for evening entertainment. Games and puzzles provided another form of evening entertainment. Card games, board games and word games could be played by lamplight and provided social interaction for families and communities. Many traditional games we know today, chess, checkers, backgammon, gained popularity partly because they could be enjoyed during the long evening hours when other activities were impractical. Religious and spiritual practices often intensified during evening hours. Morning and evening prayers were common in many households, and the quiet, contemplative atmosphere created by dim lighting was conducive to spiritual reflection. Many people used the evening hours for personal prayer, meditation, or reading religious texts. The rhythm of sleep in pre-electric society was also dramatically different from modern patterns. Without artificial lighting to extend the day, most people went to bed shortly after sunset and woke at dawn or shortly before. However, historians have discovered that many pre-electric societies practiced what was called segmented sleep, or first and second sleep. This pattern involved going to sleep shortly after dark, sleeping for 4 to 6 hours, then waking for 1 to 3 hours in the middle of the night, before returning to sleep until dawn. During this middle-of-the-night wake period, people would engage in quiet activities like prayer, meditation, intimate conversation with spouses, or simple household tasks. Some would use this time to check on animals or tend to fires. This wakeful period was considered normal and natural, not a sign of insomnia as it might be viewed today. The segmented sleep pattern was so common that it was referenced in literature, legal documents, and household guides. Shakespeare mentioned first sleep in several plays. Court records from the era show that nighttime crimes were often scheduled around the period between first and second sleep, when people were known to be awake. The practice was so ingrained that when artificial lighting began to change sleep patterns, many people experienced it as a loss rather than an improvement. Work patterns in pre-electric society varied dramatically by season in ways that modern life, with its climate-controlled environments and artificial lighting, rarely experiences. Summer days could stretch to 16 hours of productive daylight, while winter days might offer only 8 hours of good working light. This created natural rhythms of intensive work during long summer days and more contemplative, indoor-focused activities during short winter days. Agricultural societies planned their entire year around these natural rhythms. Spring and summer were times of intensive outdoor work, planting, tending crops, and preparing for harvest. The long daylight hours of summer allowed farmers to work from dawn to dusk, maximizing their productivity during the growing season. Harvest time, in particular, was a period of almost around-the-clock work, with entire communities mobilizing to bring in crops before weather could destroy them. Winter, by contrast, was a time for indoor work, planning, and preparation. Farmers would repair tools, build furniture, and maintain buildings during the short winter days. Women would focus on textile work, spinning, weaving, and sewing the clothes that would be needed for the coming year. Food preservation and preparation were major winter activities, as families processed the harvest and prepared foods that would sustain them until the next growing season. This seasonal variation created natural periods of intense activity followed by relative rest, something completely foreign to our modern work culture with its steady year-round pace. Pre-electric people worked incredibly hard during peak seasons, but also had extended periods of less intensive work during which they could recover, plan, and engage in activities that weren't immediately productive. Craftsmen and artisans developed sophisticated techniques for working with limited and variable lighting. Blacksmiths learned to judge the temperature of metal by its color in dim forge light. Seamstresses developed the ability to sew intricate patterns by feel. Carpenters created joints and measured cuts using techniques that relied more on touch and experience than on precise visual measurement. Many crafts were specifically adapted to the realities of pre-electric lighting. Quilting, for instance, became popular partly because it could be worked on in sections during whatever light was available, and multiple people could work on the same project simultaneously around a single lamp. Woodcarving often focused on bold, simple designs that didn't require fine detail work that would strain the eyes in poor light. The social aspects of work were much more prominent in pre-electric society. Because artificial lighting was expensive and dim, people often gathered together to share light sources while working. This led to traditions like quilting bees, barn raisings, and husking bees, social events that combined work with community interaction. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They accomplished necessary tasks more efficiently, they distributed the cost of lighting among multiple people, and they provided social interaction during long winter months when individual families might otherwise be isolated. Education in pre-electric society had to adapt to the realities of natural lighting and the demands of daily survival. Formal schooling, when it existed, typically took place during the middle hours of the day when natural light was best. However, most education happened through apprenticeship and hands-on learning as children worked alongside adults. The absence of electric lighting meant that studying was a daytime activity for most people. Evening study was possible only for those who could afford adequate lighting, which often meant only the wealthy or those training for professions like medicine or law. This created additional barriers to education beyond the obvious ones of cost and social class. However, oral education flourished in pre-electric society. Children learned through listening, memorization, and repetition. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was a crucial educational tool. Historical events, moral lessons, practical knowledge, and cultural values were all transmitted through stories that could be shared without books or artificial lighting. Religious education often took place during evening hours as families gathered around their fires or lamps to read from religious texts or discuss spiritual matters. For many people, these evening religious discussions were their primary exposure to literacy and abstract thinking. Travel and transportation in the pre-electric era were dramatically constrained by the availability of natural light, long distance. Travel was typically planned around the seasons, with most people avoiding travel during the short days of winter when darkness limited safe travel time. Roads were dangerous enough in daylight. Traveling in darkness was often considered foolhardy. The rhythm of travel was entirely different from modern experiences. Travelers would typically start their journeys at dawn and stop well before sunset to find lodging or make camp. The concept of driving through the night to reach a destination was virtually impossible for most people. This meant that long journeys were measured in days or weeks rather than hours, and travelers had to plan carefully for overnight stops. Communication over long distances was similarly constrained by the pre-electric world. Without electric lighting, writing letters was a daytime activity for most people. The mail system operated during daylight hours, and news traveled slowly. People received news of distant events weeks or months after they occurred, creating a very different relationship with information than we experience today. However, this slower pace of communication also created deeper local connections. Since people couldn't easily communicate with distant friends and relatives, they invested more heavily in relationships with neighbors and local community members. Local news and gossip were shared face-to-face during daily encounters, creating stronger community bonds. Entertainment and leisure activities in pre-electric society were almost entirely social and participatory. Without movies, television, radio, or recorded music, people created their own entertainment. This led to rich traditions of folk music, storytelling, games, and community celebrations that modern electric entertainment has largely replaced. Community festivals and celebrations took on enormous importance in pre-electric society. These events provided relief from the routine of daily work and offered opportunities for socializing, courtship, and cultural expression. Harvest festivals, religious holidays, and seasonal celebrations were eagerly anticipated and carefully planned. They often lasted for several days and included dancing, music, games, and special foods that weren't available during ordinary times. Dancing was particularly important in pre-electric entertainment because it required no special equipment, could be done by lamplight or firelight, and provided physical activity during long winter months when outdoor work was limited. Community dances were major social events that brought together people from wide geographic areas. Sports and physical games also played important roles in pre-electric leisure. Many traditional sports, wrestling, foot races, various ball games, required no special equipment and could be enjoyed during daylight hours. These activities provided entertainment, physical exercise, and opportunities for friendly competition between communities. The absence of electric refrigeration meant that food preservation and preparation consumed enormous amounts of time and energy in pre-electric society. Without refrigerators or freezers, families had to use other methods to preserve food: smoking, salting, drying, canning, and root cellars. These preservation methods required constant attention and careful timing. Food preparation was also much more time-consuming without electric appliances. Grain had to be ground by hand or taken to mills. Bread was baked in wood-fired ovens that required skill to operate properly. Meals were cooked over open fires or on wood-burning stoves that demanded constant attention. The simple act of preparing a family meal could take several hours and required considerable skill and experience. However, this labor-intensive approach to food also created opportunities for social interaction and skill sharing. Cooking was often a communal activity, with women gathering to share large cooking tasks like bread baking or food preservation. Children learned cooking skills by watching and helping, creating strong intergenerational knowledge transfer. The seasonal nature of food availability also created natural rhythms of feast and relative scarcity that shaped social customs and celebrations. Fresh fruits and vegetables were available only during specific seasons, making their appearance special events worth celebrating. Meat was often available only after slaughter times in late fall, creating traditions around shared butchering and preservation. Medical care in the pre-electric era had to rely entirely on natural light and simple tools. Doctors made house calls during daylight hours when they could see properly to examine patients. Surgery, when it was attempted, was scheduled for midday when natural light was strongest. The absence of electric lighting meant that medical emergencies occurring at night were often dealt with using whatever dim artificial light was available, making treatment more dangerous and less effective. However, the slower pace of pre-electric life also meant that many health problems we associate with modern life were less common. People got more physical exercise as a natural part of their daily work. They ate more seasonal, locally produced foods. The absence of electric lighting meant their sleep patterns were more closely aligned with natural circadian rhythms, which many modern sleep researchers believe is healthier. Mental health in pre-electric society was approached very differently than today. The strong community connections and clear social roles provided psychological support systems that modern individualistic society often lacks. However, the isolation of winter months and the constant struggle for survival also created unique psychological challenges. The role of women in pre-electric society was heavily shaped by the demands of maintaining a household without electric appliances. Women's work was never-ending, maintaining fires, preparing meals, making and mending clothes, caring for children, and preserving food. However, this work was also highly valued because it was clearly essential for family survival. Many, traditionally, women's crafts, spinning, weaving, sewing, cooking, gardening, were elevated to high art forms in pre-electric society because they were so crucial to daily life. Women developed extraordinary skills in these areas, and their expertise was recognized and respected within their communities. The absence of electric lighting also meant that much of women's finest work, intricate needlework, detailed cooking, and careful food preservation, had to be done during prime daylight hours. This created natural rhythms where women's most skilled work occurred during the same hours when men were doing their most important outdoor labor. Children's lives in pre-electric society were shaped by the need to contribute to household survival from an early age. However, this work was also their education, teaching them skills they would need as adults. Children learned by doing, working alongside adults, and gradually taking on more responsibility as they grew older. Play for children often involved games and activities that prepared them for adult roles. Girls played with dolls and practiced household skills through play. Boys played games that developed physical strength and coordination needed for farm work or trades. Many traditional children's games and toys served dual purposes as entertainment and education. The seasonal rhythms of pre-electric life created natural variations in children's activities. Summer months might involve more outdoor work and play, while winter months focused on indoor skills and storytelling. Children learned to adapt their activities to available light and weather, developing flexibility and resourcefulness that served them throughout their lives. Elderly people played crucial roles in pre-electric society that have been largely diminished. In our modern world, their accumulated knowledge and experience were invaluable in a world where survival depended on practical skills passed down through generations. Grandparents served as teachers, advisors, and keepers of family and community history. The evening hours, when outdoor work was impossible, became prime time for intergenerational knowledge transfer. Elderly people would share stories, teach skills, and pass on wisdom during the long hours when families gathered around fires and lamps. This created strong bonds between generations and ensured that valuable knowledge wasn't lost. However, aging in pre-electric society also presented unique challenges. Without electric heating, cold winter months could be particularly difficult for elderly people. The physical demands of pre-electric life meant that those who couldn't contribute to essential work might struggle to maintain their place in the household economy. The concept of privacy in pre-electric society was very different from modern expectations. Large families often lived in small spaces with minimal artificial lighting, which meant that individual privacy was rare. Family members shared bedrooms, and many activities that we consider private today were necessarily communal. However, this lack of individual privacy was balanced by strong community privacy. Without electric communication or transportation, communities were often isolated from outside scrutiny. Local customs and practices could develop without outside interference, creating distinctive regional cultures. The absence of electric lighting also created natural barriers to surveillance and social control. Authorities couldn't easily monitor Nighttime activities and the difficulty of travel meant that outside control was often weak. This created spaces for individual and community autonomy that later electric technologies would diminish. Religious and spiritual practices in pre-electric society were deeply influenced by the natural rhythms of light and darkness. Many religious traditions incorporated candles, oil lamps, or fire as sacred elements, partly because these light sources were so precious and important in daily life. The long evening hours provided natural time for prayer, meditation, and spiritual reflection. Without electric distractions, people had more time and mental space for contemplating spiritual questions. Many religious traditions developed evening prayer practices that took advantage of the quiet, contemplative atmosphere created by dim lighting. Seasonal religious celebrations were particularly important in pre-electric society because they provided light and warmth during the darkest times of the year. Christmas, Hanukkah, Diwali, and other winter festivals involving lights took on special significance when artificial light was precious and rare. The economic systems of pre-electric society were fundamentally shaped by the constraints and opportunities of natural lighting and seasonal rhythms. Most economic activity was local because transportation and communication were limited. This created strong local economies where people knew their suppliers and customers personally. Seasonal economic patterns were much more pronounced than today. Agricultural communities experienced cycles of intense activity during planting and harvest seasons, followed by quieter periods during winter months. This created natural rhythms of economic boom and relative recession that repeated annually. Craft production was often organized around the availability of natural light and seasonal materials. Textile production, for instance, might involve shearing sheep in spring, processing wool during summer, spinning during fall evenings, and weaving during long winter days. This created integrated seasonal cycles of production that made efficient use of available time and resources. The absence of electric refrigeration and transportation meant that most food systems were intensely local and seasonal. People ate foods that were produced nearby and available during specific seasons. This created deep connections between communities and their local environments, as well as sophisticated knowledge about local food systems. Markets and trading were constrained by daylight hours and seasonal transportation patterns. Market days were major social and economic events that brought together people from wide geographic areas. These markets often combined economic exchange with social interaction, news sharing, and entertainment. The monetary systems of pre-electric society often reflected the seasonal and local nature of economic activity. Many communities operated on credit systems that balanced accounts seasonally. Barter and exchange of services were common, creating complex networks of mutual obligation and support. Technological innovation in pre-electric society focused heavily on maximizing the use of natural energy sources and improving efficiency. Within the constraints of natural lighting, windmills, water wheels, and ingenious mechanical devices helped accomplish work without electric power. The design of buildings and communities was heavily influenced by the need to maximize natural lighting and heating. Houses were oriented to capture solar energy, windows were positioned to provide optimal lighting for work areas, and communities were designed to make efficient use of shared resources like mills and workshops. Transportation technology focused on reliability and efficiency rather than speed. Horses, oxen, and human power were supplemented by clever use of natural forces, like wind and water current. Road systems were designed to accommodate seasonal variations in weather and daylight availability. Communication technology in the pre-electric era was remarkably sophisticated despite its limitations. Visual signaling systems using fires, flags, and mirrors could communicate information across long distances during daylight hours. Sound signals using horns, bells and drums provided local communication networks. The printing press revolutionized communication in pre-electric society, but books and newspapers were still constrained by the availability of natural light for reading. This made literacy a more social activity, as people gathered to share reading materials and discuss their contents. Artistic and cultural expression in pre-electric society was shaped by the materials and conditions available. Architecture focused on creating beautiful and functional spaces using natural materials and locally available resources. The great cathedrals, palaces and monuments of the pre-electric era demonstrate extraordinary artistic achievement within the constraints of manual construction and natural lighting. Visual arts had to adapt to the realities of natural and artificial. Lighting. Painters learned to work with the changing quality of natural light throughout the day and developed techniques for creating works that would look good by candlelight or lamplight. Sculpture often emphasized tactile qualities that could be appreciated even in dim lighting. Music and literature flourished in pre-electric society, partly because they didn't require bright lighting to be enjoyed. The great musical and literary traditions of the world developed during the pre-electric era, creating works that remain influential today. The social nature of pre-electric entertainment encouraged participatory arts, where audiences were expected to sing along, dance, or otherwise participate rather than passively consume entertainment. Textile arts reached extraordinary levels of sophistication in pre-electric society because they were essential for clothing and household goods. The intricate patterns and techniques developed by pre-electric textile workers represent some of humanity's finest artistic achievements. These skills were passed down through generations and created distinctive regional and cultural traditions. The environmental relationship of pre-electric society was fundamentally different from our modern experience. Without electric power, people had to work within natural energy flows rather than trying to overcome them. This created deep knowledge about local environments and sustainable resource use. Waste production was minimal in pre-electric society because materials were too valuable to discard carelessly. Everything was reused, repaired, or recycled until it was completely worn out. This created closed-loop systems where waste from one process became input for another. Energy use was entirely renewable in pre-electric society. Solar energy provided light and heat, wind and water-powered mills and transportation, and biomass provided fuel for heating and cooking. While this limited what people could accomplish, it also meant that their activities were inherently sustainable. The knowledge systems of pre-electric society were remarkably sophisticated, despite the lack of electric communication and computation. Oral traditions preserved vast amounts of practical and cultural knowledge across generations. Skilled craftsmen developed techniques and knowledge that rival modern industrial processes in their effectiveness. Navigation and astronomy reached high levels of sophistication in pre-electric society because people depended on natural signs for travel and timekeeping. Farmers developed detailed knowledge about weather patterns, soil conditions, and crop varieties that allowed them to successfully grow food in challenging conditions. Medical knowledge in pre-electric society was often remarkably effective, despite the lack of modern diagnostic tools. Traditional medicine systems, developed over thousands of years, incorporated sophisticated understanding of human health and effective treatments using natural materials. The social organization of pre-electric society was designed to function effectively within the constraints of natural lighting and seasonal rhythms. Extended families and close communities provided support systems that helped individuals survive difficult periods. Social roles were clearly defined and valued because everyone's contribution was necessary for community survival. Leadership in Pre-electric society often emerged from demonstrated competence in essential skills rather than abstract qualifications. Community leaders were typically people who had proven their ability to help others survive and thrive within the constraints of pre-electric life. Conflict resolution in pre-electric society had to rely on face-to-face communication and community pressure rather than distant authorities. This created sophisticated systems of local justice and social control that emphasized restoration and community harmony over punishment. The psychological and emotional aspects of pre-electric life were shaped by the close connection to natural rhythms and the strong interdependence within communities. People experienced seasonal affective changes that matched the natural cycles of light and darkness. Winter months were recognized as naturally more introspective and contemplative, while summer months were times of external activity and energy. The absence of electric entertainment meant that people had to develop internal resources for dealing with boredom and solitude. This led to rich inner lives and strong capacities for self-reflection and meditation. Many people developed skills in mental calculation, memory, and creative thinking that are less common in our electric age. However, pre-electric life also involved psychological challenges that modern people rarely face. The constant awareness of life's fragility and the immediate consequences of poor decisions created different types of stress and anxiety. The isolation of winter months and the physical demands of daily survival tested psychological resilience in ways that modern life rarely requires. The transition from pre-electric to electric society happened gradually over several decades and was experienced differently by different social groups. Wealthy urban areas got electricity first, while rural areas often waited decades for electric service. This created a period when some people lived with electric conveniences, while others continued traditional pre-electric lifestyles. Early electric lighting was often unreliable and expensive, so many people continued to rely on oil lamps and candles as backup lighting. The transition period saw hybrid lifestyles where people used both electric and traditional technologies, depending on availability and cost. The social and cultural changes that accompanied electrification were profound and often unexpected. The ability to extend productive hours into the evening changed work patterns, family life, and community relationships. The standardization of time that came with electric lighting began to erode the seasonal and task-based rhythms that had governed human life for millennia. Looking back at pre-electric life from our modern perspective, it's easy to focus on the hardships and limitations. People worked harder physically, had less control over their environment, and faced dangers that electric technology has largely eliminated. Medical care was primitive, communication was slow, and many conveniences we take for granted were unavailable. However, pre-electric life also offered experiences and benefits that electric society has lost. The close connection to natural rhythms provided a different relationship with time and seasons that many modern people find lacking in their lives. The strong community bonds and clear social roles provided security and meaning that individualistic, electric society sometimes struggles to replace. The skills and knowledge developed in pre-electric society represented extraordinary human adaptation to natural constraints. People developed remarkable abilities to work efficiently with limited resources, to read natural signs and patterns, and to create beauty and meaning within significant constraints. Perhaps most importantly, pre-electric society demonstrates that humans can live fulfilling, productive, and meaningful lives without the electric technologies we now consider essential. The billions of people who lived before electricity weren't just surviving. They were creating art, literature, music, and philosophy that continue to inspire us today. They built civilizations, explored the world, and developed technologies that formed the foundation for our modern electric world. The daily life of pre-electric people was challenging in ways we can barely imagine, but it was also rich with experiences that electric life has largely eliminated. The slow pace allowed for deep engagement with immediate surroundings and close relationships. The seasonal rhythms created natural periods of intense activity and restful reflection. The dependence on local resources created intimate knowledge of regional environments and close community bonds. Understanding how people lived before electricity doesn't mean romanticizing the past or suggesting we should abandon electric technology. Rather, it helps us understand what we've gained and what we've lost in the transition to electric society. It reminds us that many of the things we consider essential for happiness and fulfillment are actually recent innovations, and that humans are remarkably adaptable and resourceful when faced with constraints. The story of pre-electric life is ultimately a story about human creativity, resilience, and community. Faced with the fundamental constraints of natural lighting and seasonal rhythms, people developed sophisticated solutions that allowed them not just to survive, but to thrive. They created rich cultures, meaningful relationships, and lasting achievements that continue to influence our electric world. As we consider the future of human society and our relationship with technology, the experience of pre-electric life offers valuable perspectives. It reminds us that technology is a tool for human flourishing, not an end in itself. It suggests that some of the problems we try to solve with ever more sophisticated technology might be better addressed by understanding how people lived successfully. Without those technologies, the millions of hours that pre-electric people spent in activities we might consider primitive or inefficient were actually investments in skills, relationships, and cultural knowledge that sustained communities across generations. Their patient adaptation to natural constraints created sustainable ways of life that supported human flourishing for thousands of years. In our rush to embrace each new electric innovation, we might benefit from occasionally asking how pre-electric people would have approached similar challenges. Their solutions often emphasized sustainability, community cooperation, and working with natural systems rather than trying to overcome them. These approaches remain relevant even in our highly electrified world. The daily rhythms of pre-electric life, rising with the sun, working during peak daylight hours, gathering together during evening hours, and sleeping in harmony with natural darkness, represent patterns that supported human health and community for most of our species' existence. While we may not want to abandon electric lighting entirely, understanding these natural rhythms can help us make better choices about when and how to use our electric technologies. The story of what people did all day before electricity is ultimately a story about what it means to be human. Stripped of the electric conveniences we now consider essential, people still found ways to work, play, learn, love, and create meaning in their lives. They developed skills and relationships that electric technology has made less necessary but not less valuable. Perhaps the most important lesson from pre-electric life is that human happiness and fulfillment don't depend primarily on technological convenience, but on meaningful work, close relationships, and a sense of connection to something larger than ourselves. These fundamental human needs were met successfully for thousands of years without electric power, and they remain the foundation of human well-being even in our electric age. The ingenuity, creativity, and resilience that people demonstrated in their pre-electric daily lives represent some of humanity's greatest achievements. They remind us that we are capable of remarkable adaptation, and that our ancestors were not primitive people waiting for technology to rescue them, but fully realized human beings who created rich, meaningful lives within the constraints of their time. As we continue to develop new electric technologies and to grapple with their consequences, the example of pre-electric life offers both humility and hope. It reminds us that humans have always been remarkably adaptable and creative, finding ways to thrive within whatever constraints they face. It suggests that our electric technologies, remarkable as they are just the latest chapter in humanity's ongoing story of adaptation and innovation. The daily life of people before electricity was not a prologue to real human history, but a complete and sophisticated way of life that sustained billions of people across thousands of years. Understanding how they filled their days, met their challenges, and found meaning in their lives enriches our understanding of human possibility and reminds us that we are part of a much larger story than our electric age might suggest.